Hello, my name is Jennifer Karchmer, and I am the host and producer of the Transparency Report. You can find more information on my website, jenniferkarchmer.com. My guest today is Shannon Sedgwick. He is CEO of Global Media Risk. It's a consulting firm based in Australia and the US, and it offers training, equipment, and protection to journalists, humanitarians, and corporate clients, basically anyone going to dangerous regions. Our focus today will be on journalists. Shannon himself has worked in dangerous regions around the world doing crisis and emergency management. He is an experienced disaster and emergency incident commander in both national and international locations. Today, in fact, he comes to us from Nevada in the United States. Thank you very much, Shannon, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
In fact, what city are you located in Nevada, or is that a confidential location?
No, we're in beautiful Lake Tahoe.
Oh, that is a lovely place. You're originally from Australia, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm originally from Sydney. I moved to the US from Sydney about 7 months ago.
Okay, and you're enjoying your work and your stay here, I hope?
Oh, I love the US. Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant.
Okay, well, your work has taken you around the world. In fact, I was reading on your website, and this is the way that we met, a blog post where you talk specifically about embedded journalists and some of the safety concerns that they should have. And the question that I posed was, what is the protocol for journalists, embedded or not, to be carrying weapons? Is that something that is prudent? Is that something frowned upon? Is it a practical consideration? Would you talk a little bit about that post about embedded journalists and some of the recommendations you had, and then what indeed is the answer from your point of view about journalists carrying weapons?
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. There's people fall on both sides of the line there, but I think to maintain a journalist's neutrality in a situation or in conflict zones, they can never be armed. Under no situation or circumstance, I don't think journalists should ever be armed, even when embedded with soldiers. It's a difficult situation when you're embedded with a military unit, because there's certain rules that you have to abide by, what you can and can't broadcast. It's quite strict, especially when working with the American military. They have quite strict guidelines, and often if somebody has criticized their actions previously, they won't even get a chance to be embedded. They're vetted quite heavily. But in terms of arming yourself, it's never an option for journalists, because you instantly lose that middle ground, that neutrality that journalists need, first of all, to keep them safe, and to provide a neutral story. That they can't be seen to be favoring one side or the other. Otherwise, it's just it's bias, and people won't respond as well to what they're publishing or what they're broadcasting. But journalists embedded with soldiers, they shouldn't just rely on the soldiers for their safety too. That's a big thing. People think as soon as they're embedded in with the military, then the military's job is to look after them. That's not correct, especially in frontline soldiers. The job of a frontline soldier is to take the fight to the enemy, or protect the people within the region. That there's different missions, but their objective is their mission. Their mission isn't to look after that journalist. I've always recommended to clients that if they are going to embed with a military force, that they do take a private consultant, such as someone from our company, to look after their safety and their logistics, because that's not the military's primary concern. The unit
is that one of the services that you do provide? So if I were a journalist and I had all the protocol, I've been vetted, and I have the permissions to be embedded with the military, could I say, well, I'm bringing along this person from Global Media Risk, for example?
Well, we'd have to go through the same vetting, but it's been done, and it's easy to do, and it would probably take quite a load off the unit commander and the people involved if they knew they were being looked after by a separate individual or a separate company. It would make their job a lot easier. They wouldn't have to worry about that journalist, being hurt or being in the wrong position, or many journalists who embed with military units. Some of them have never been to a conflict zone before, or they don't know the difference between cover and concealment, basic things that can save their life. And having a private consultant come along with them who knows, first of all, most of our consultants are ex-military, so they've been in that situation before. So they can provide that happy medium.
Now, would that person, let's say from Global Media Risk, would they be armed themselves?
Depends where. That's an interesting question. Depends where we are. There's certain rules in different countries that prohibit us from carrying weapons. If it's Iraq or Afghanistan, most likely, yes, we would be carrying. If it's somewhere that's a bit more strict, say, somewhere in Africa, they're quite strict on foreigners carrying weapon systems, then most likely we would not be. But if you're with soldiers and something happens, there's always a weapon close by if it did come to that. That's very much a last resort, because we try to remain neutral along with our clients. So otherwise, we're seen as a combative force also, and that's not our role. Our role is to keep the journalists safe.
So for purposes of education, what is the difference between cover and conceal?
Well, concealment will hide you from the enemy, or someone who's, say, not the enemy, but someone who's shooting at you or shooting at your group. But it doesn't stop rounds or bullets or projectiles or even shrapnel from hitting you. It doesn't provide cover. Now, cover is, say, a thick concrete wall, or a vehicle or an engine block of a vehicle. That is cover that would stop rounds from actually impacting you or impacting those around you. There's a big difference. Just because the enemy can't see you doesn't mean that they can't shoot through a wall, like a small wall or a plaster or things like that. There's a big difference between cover and concealment. And a lot of people think because they can't see who's shooting at them and the enemy can't see them, they're safe, and that's just not correct.
Let's talk a little bit more about these practical concerns. That's what interests me. I personally have not worked in a conflict zone. In fact, one of the places I traveled in 2012 is Iceland, which is quite the opposite. Very peaceful. Yeah. And no conflict. In fact, I went there purposefully because I was studying freedom of the press from Reporters Without Borders standpoint in the annual index they put out. And I looked at the top 10 countries that are typically at the top of what we consider freedom of the press, Iceland and many Scandinavian countries being on that list. So yeah, that's a very safe place to be. But let's talk about a dangerous region. And if I were to take a hostile environment training course as a journalist, what are some of the things that I would be taught, and how many days would it typically cover?
Well, typically a hostile environment awareness training course, or a HEAT course, we call it. Some people call it a hostile environment first aid training course, HEFAT, but there's a few different names for it, but essentially they cover the same thing. Is the main priority behind it is the first aid training. Now, it's not just basic first aid training. They should be trained at the same level as someone in the military. They should carry the same kit as someone in the military, a trauma first aid kit, and they should be trained in trauma first aid. And the minimum time for that kind of training is 4 days. Now, we're aligned with the Institute and that News Safety Institute, the International News Safety Institute, and their minimum amount of time for these HEAT training courses are 4 days for that reason, because it allows maximum exposure to the training. And it's a steep learning curve when you've had no first aid background and all of a sudden you're working on these very real and very advanced simulations where we use actual amputees with fake blood and meat, and it's all very, smoke everywhere, gunfire. It's all very real. We try and make it as real as possible, because doing first aid in a calm classroom isn't realistic. It's not going to be like that. But apart from first aid that we cover, risk analysis, and risk awareness, how media can conduct their own risk analysis of a situation, and whether they can balance their aims of achieving a good story with the aim of remaining safe. You have to achieve that balance. Oftentimes you have to put yourself in a bit of danger to get the right story. That's the aim of the conflict journalist.
A
there's always
bit of danger.
danger.
You're saying a bit of danger.
A bit
So
of
yeah,
danger.
I
And
mean, is there a mathematical equation that you're using here? But give us some specifics. I mean, give me an actual setting where a journalist, where you've done some training.
well, it's a personal. It comes down to personal comfort with the level of danger. We've worked with German clients from a media organisation who 5 kilometres from the front line was too close to them, too close for them. That's their personal comfort level. They didn't want to go past that, and that's fine with me. And then you have mostly American journalists who are very gung ho, and they want to be amongst the front line. They want to be right next to the troops with the bullets crack thumping behind them. It's just personal comfort level. But I had an interesting situation on the border of Kobane while that was being besieged by ISIS. We were there for 5 weeks with some broadcasting clients, and there was a Swedish reporter, a young lady who she was quite a good reporter, quite experienced in Syria and Iraq, and she decided that it'd be a good idea to cross into Kobane secretly, cross one of the unmanned checkpoints and jump a fence. And she was gone for about 4 hours by herself. Small, blonde, very noticeable. And she came back. She was cuts all over her legs. She was only wearing flip-flops on her feet. And so I would not recommend that if she had have been my client. I just knew who she was. If she had have been my client, I would have advised her against going into Kobane while ISIS were besieging it, and there was a lot of indirect fire and artillery fire and mortars coming in. And she was very lucky. And she was very lucky she got let back in by the Turkish authorities, because they weren't letting anybody in or out of Kobane at that stage. But it comes down to people's comfort level.
Let's talk a little bit about some practical concerns, like you said, footwear, for example, clothing, but also being aware of customs and culture
Yes.
and your gender, whether you're male or female. What is that type of training? Do you then bring in someone with that cultural training, or what has your experience been, as an Australian, and what have you learned about some of the specifics? Let's also talk about climate and how that can affect protection from the sun, dehydration, is there enough water, and food?
Well, that's what you wear and what you carry with you are very big issues, and we cover that as suggested load lists for different countries. We've been to almost every conflict and disaster zone within the last 5 years, so we understand from first-hand experience, exactly what is required in regards to culture and customs. Especially in regards to female journalists, they have to be a lot more careful in some of these Middle Eastern and Central Asian countries where it's frowned upon to say, have your head uncovered. And we cover a lot of that cultural awareness, and we also we welcome individual questions. If somebody might be deploying somewhere soon, we welcome them to come and ask us. And if we don't know, we will endeavour to find out. We've got a vast, network of experience amongst the company, and we definitely have an answer. But in terms of protective equipment and protective clothing, you should always wear long pants. It doesn't matter how hot it is, you wear long pants. It provides protection from shrapnel, dust, skin ailments. It's a number of things. Enclosed shoes, preferably hiking boots, are great. Never wear steel caps, because if it's steel-toed boots or anything, because if it's cold, you'll get frostbite on your toes. You never wear steel caps. Also, they get quite hot in the summer as well.
Do you speak from experience? Have you worn the steel toes, or you learned this early on in your military training?
No, I actually learned that before my military training. I grew up in the mountains in Victoria in Australia, where we had quite a lot of snow during winter, and it was a very strict rule that no one was to wear steel capped boots for that very reason, because it'll freeze your toes. But in terms of, you always wear long sleeve shirts if you can. Again, the same reason as the pants, to cover your skin. Some people do wear short sleeve shirts. I always wear long sleeve, also because I have tattoos. That's quite a big taboo. Some countries just don't like tattoos, and it also makes you recognizable. If you're in a country where you're trying to remain a little bit more low key, the last thing you need to do is show distinguishing features such as tattoos. And a lot of ex-military guys like myself, we have a lot of tattoos, and it's best to hide them. But a lot of journalists have tattoos. It's best to not show them off, because they may offend some individuals, within the local national community where they're working. But also in regards to heat illness, that's what we come across the most. Heat illnesses, so they get heat stroke or dehydrated, and once you're already thirsty, you're dehydrated already. And a lot of journalists forget to drink enough water, or get in some shade, or eat sufficient food. Just out on the front line, it's hard to get the right amount of food, which is why I always recommend carrying rations of some sort. Even American military MREs, meals ready to eat. There's many ways to remain safe on the battlefield, or on the front line, or when you're doing quite a rough story in an austere environment. There's always ways to keep yourself hydrated, keep yourself fed, and logistics is a hugely important part of getting the story right. It has to be a sustainable operation that you're running.
Those are great practical considerations you have. Let's talk about the atmosphere and the climate for journalists who are working in conflict zones. Years ago, and I mean, I think we're talking 15, 20, 30 years ago, there was a time when reporters would be in war zones and they would wear a jacket that actually said press on it, and they were considered protected. People wouldn't go after them, and there was a level of respect for the profession and that role as war correspondent. I believe, and this is before my time, talking back to days of even the Vietnam War era, because you've been on the front lines, and based on stories, blogs, and reports from journalists on the front lines, it seems that a journalist would not want to actually be identified and wear a jacket or a vest that says press. What is your experience? What have you observed? And then what's your recommendation, given the fact that you're a CEO of Global Media Risk?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's something I've discussed many times, is that journalists are no longer as neutral as they used to be. They still are offered some protection from being press in certain regions, but there's some countries that sometimes it's not a benefit to be revealed as press, because you may be persecuted or even targeted for that affiliation, such as Israel currently in the West Bank and Gaza. Especially in the West Bank right now, there's been numerous attacks against journalists from the IDF, and also it's been less covered, but also by Palestinians. I was in West Bank recently for a couple of weeks with clients, and we were targeted with, specifically us, were targeted with tear gas and rubber bullets, because we were filming exactly what they were doing to the Palestinian protesters, and they don't appreciate that. Also in Iraq, if you're working anywhere in northern Iraq or around ISIS-controlled areas, probably not a good idea to wear a big jacket or body armor with press emblazoned across the front or the back. It's a personal choice when it comes down to that, but it's different for every situation. I think most countries, you should still identify yourself as press, and oftentimes it helps you get through certain checkpoints, having your press credentials, or having your vehicle identified as press, especially when there's military flights going across in your area, or military airstrikes. So it's probably a good idea to even have press in big writing using electrical tape across the hood or the top of your car to identify your vehicle as a press vehicle. Certain steps like that are often helpful, but it comes down to personal choice, what they're comfortable with, but mostly down to the country they're operating in, or the region they're operating in, will dictate the need for identifying or not identifying themselves as press so blatantly.
So let's talk about some of your clients. It's up to you whether you can name names, but I'm curious to know of both older clients and younger clients. And again, do you have older clients who say, years ago, I never would have hired somebody. We just went out there. Today, it's a different climate. And then also, what has your experience been with a younger client? Are they more savvy? Do they already have previous training, either through other consulting firms, or are they getting this kind of training through their university, through journalism programs, either in the US or from schools abroad?
Well, that's a great question. The older, I've had it said to me many times, a number of our clients, especially from a broadcasting company that we will work with in Europe, quite a lot. And we don't usually name our clients, but they have quite senior staff and very, very experienced, speak numerous languages, and they've been doing this since Bosnia and Falklands, all that. They've been everywhere and seen everything. Now, they've had no formal training usually. They've just learned from experience and learned by doing along the way, and luckily they were able to come out of it relatively unscathed. Not everyone makes it that far, and there's quite a number of psychological stresses that attributed to that type of work, especially for a long duration. But yeah, they often say to me, and say to the guys that work for me, back in our day, we didn't need guys like you, or some of them still don't think that they need people like us. They're quite prideful of their experience and that they can look after themselves, but it doesn't matter how good of a cameraman or a journalist or a correspondent you are. You've got to concentrate on your role. And if you're concentrating on your role as a correspondent completely, then you can't focus on your safety and security as much, and that leaves you exposed. But the younger generation seem to understand it a bit more, and they enjoy having us along. Not that our older clients don't enjoy having us along. They're used to us now, and they know how much we contribute. Because on a side note, myself and the guys who work for me, I make sure they're all trained in media production, basic media production, how to set up SNG trucks, basic camera operation, basic things like tripods, even live views, the man packs, and basic production techniques. So a lot of the times we don't identify ourselves as security personnel. We'll act like one of the journalists. We'll carry a tripod or even a camera. And if we can set up or break down a production site and help our clients do that, as long as the security situation allows it, it makes us a lot more helpful to the clients, and we can understand their production needs and also meet it with our aims of providing them security and logistics. It's quite helpful, and it makes us quite unique, because most other firms that do the sort of work we do are just stand back as if they're bodyguards, and that's all that they do. They just provide security, whereas we are involved. We provide an extra level of service to the client.
Oh, it does bring in another question in terms, going back to what we said before about, if you're a reporter, definitely identifying yourself as such. And here you're saying that you are the consultant, you're the protector, the trainer. You're going to help out with some of the setup and so forth, and you may identify yourself as a journalist. Are there ethical considerations there in terms of what your role really is? And then the second part is the cost of this. Feel free to mention dollars, but are companies hiring you per day? Is it per week, per project? I would think that those costs would tend to be astronomical, especially for media companies that have already cut back on their foreign bureaus, international journalists.
Yep.
But yet, being able to afford the work that you do with such a high level of risk.
Well, it's nothing is cheap when it comes to conflict zones or dangerous areas. But we, in terms of comparing us to other providers of our type of services, are on the very, very low end of cost. We have minimal overheads with our company. We ensure that we pass on those savings to our clients. We're usually hired on a per diem basis, the same as most journalists work, but staff journalists I'm talking about here. And we work on a per diem rate. And it's quite affordable, surprisingly affordable to some people. And also that added service that we provide of being able to provide production. I actually am recently for a shoot in Fukushima, Japan, a producer was not able to attend last minute, and I actually produced most of that shot working as a producer because there was not a whole lot for me to do there in terms of I was there to monitor radiation levels within Fukushima and around the reactor, and all the filming sites, and the actual radiation in Fukushima now can only be distributed through either the water or dust. And it rained the entire time we were there, so there was no dust, so there was minimal for me to do. So I actually got a producer credit on that particular TV series, that show for that series, and helped produce. And that just makes you really valuable to the client. So we really are quite, you get a lot of bang for your buck. And in terms of the ethical considerations in identifying ourselves as press, I hesitate to do it in a lot of situations, but if it helps us get through a checkpoint on our way to a filming site or on our way to a frontline, I'll do it. Oftentimes I carry the same press credentials as our clients do. I still have all those press credentials, and it does give us a neutrality along with our clients that we work with. They'll let us through to the front line, whereas if I just kept identifying myself as security, a lot of people find security very aggressive. They find, and soldiers don't like private security typically, especially third world countries. They're distrustful of people like us, and that's been ingrained in them for quite a long time. They might even go to the point of searching us for weapons, and we just don't need that sort of scrutiny. So identifying.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, if you've experienced that, bringing up ethical considerations, there's practical and survival skills that one would need to employ at that time. It creates an interesting synergy between your company and journalists, and a real rapport in the relationship. I'd like to talk about freelancers, because more and more freelance journalists are the ones covering these stories. Are they also your clients? Let's talk about, again, the financial considerations, because then I want it to trickle down to the public. If the public truly is interested in reading about the stories that are coming out of Syria or other regions that are closed off, and security and certainly the dangerous aspects of it, and we want to know these stories, people need to be there. And many of them are freelancers, yet they're in a situation where they need to hire a firm. They're also, probably not getting paid very much by news organizations. So it's this whole circle of information, but yet the cost of it. People don't want to pay for their news. They want to get everything free. So what's your take on that? And if you've had freelance clients as well?
Well, freelance clients, it's a whole different kettle of fish. I have never seen, nor have I never heard of freelance journalists being able to afford a consultancy, no matter how cost effective they are. Like even us, a freelancer just can't afford to hire a consultant to come along with them, unless they have very, very famous freelance correspondent I've never seen before. But the main thing for freelance correspondents that we work with is the training. The training. I can't express enough how important the training is for freelance journalists, because they won't have someone like myself or one of my staff on the ground with them. For freelance journalists, it's very, very dangerous for them, and oftentimes they go even further than staff journalists. They have a much broader spectrum of what is allowable risk. And you often see them going in a taxi with a taxi driver to the front lines that they've never met before, from the airport straight to the front line. No logistics, no backup, no vehicle of their own, just themselves and their camera, and they're by themselves. It's a very dangerous situation. And the level of the financial assistance that they receive is very minimal. I've heard of unbelievable pictures of in combat or conflict zones being paid only $20 for a photo by publishers and news agencies, which is just disgusting. These people put their lives on the line to get these shots and to get these stories, and they are paid minimal for it. And I think that's quite wrong. I think if a company is going to hire freelancers, They should only hire freelancers that have conducted a recognized hostile environment awareness training course or a trauma first aid training course. They should only hire because they have a duty of care, even to freelancers. News agencies have a duty of care to protect those who work underneath them, whether they are staff or freelancers. And I think that should be something that all large media organizations, even smaller ones, should sign off on.
Well, that brings up earlier this year, you may be aware that several, more than 25, I believe, including INSEE, the International News Safety Institute, which you are, I believe, partnered with,
Yep.
signed onto a list of freelance guidelines
Yes.
that really put out there, document what some of the guidelines are that media organizations should look for before hiring. And it's also a document, I believe, to protect freelancers. So it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg, because an organization may say, we only want to hire you if you've had this type of training. But for me to have that type of training means I need a few $1,000s or whatever those funds are to get the training. And to get the training also, do I need to demonstrate that I'm already a conflict zone reporter, that I've already been? At least some places will ask for that versus, I guess, a newbie. How does your organization handle that?
Well, I think, and I've read that document quite thoroughly a number of times, and it's great. I think it's a great initiative, and there's been quite a few large media organizations that have signed on to it already. But it needs to continue. It needs to be across the board. It needs to be a unified standard that all media companies are upheld to. It's in terms of hiring the right freelancer for the job, that's up to the media organization, of course. They shouldn't be hiring inexperienced conflict reporters. It all comes down to their CV. But for freelance reporters, there are quite a number of opportunities for them to receive free training or heavily discounted training. My organization, the HEAT training that we run, we offer a significant discount to freelancers. They can tag on the end of our clients' courses that we run just for a specific media company, and they can tag on the end of that for quite a reduced price. Most of our courses are on demand, and we liaise with the clients to do that, because oftentimes our deployments, my instructors and myself are the same people that deploy with our clients. So whenever we come back from a deployment, we have new things to teach. The situation and the threat situation and the lessons learned are always evolving, always changing. Then you get some of these larger companies whose instructors haven't deployed anywhere since the start of the Iraq War. It's a completely different situation now, and teaching outdated techniques is going to get somebody in harm's way. And we are quite aware of that, and we try and remain at the tip of the spear, so to speak, in our training. And it's always adapting and always changing according to the current situation in conflict zones and things. We try and adapt our training to our clients' needs. So if they work in more disaster zones, not so much conflict zones, we teach them lessons learned from recently Nepal and even more recent Pakistan. And we sent staff to both of those. I went to Nepal myself. There was a lot of lessons learned from that deployment. And freelancers, they do have opportunities that they never used to. As I said before, there's access to free training. INSEE, they run cost-effective training or free training, but there's very limited space in those groups, and there's quite a long waiting list, I'm quite sure. And also for RISK, the organization that Sebastian Junger set up, which is quite a good one, but they have minimal courses running, and there's always a waiting list for those. And they do a great job, but oftentimes they need that training sooner. They can't be on a wait list. So we try and offer that cost-effective training. It's still expensive for freelancers, but it's a necessary training. It's something that they need to do. And if they've had training before, we run refresher training for a 2-day refresher training course as well. So.
Oh, excellent. Well, just so viewers are familiar, it's called the Global Safety Principles and Practices. It can easily be Googled. And it's actually posted on the DART Center's website, which is part of Columbia University, that does research and provides expertise related to trauma for journalists who have, done a variety of work. And then you've mentioned RISC, which is RISC, Reporters Instructed in Saving Colleagues, which, as you mentioned, is the organization that Sebastian Junger started, and it's based in New York. Let's talk about ISIS real briefly, and then we'll move into our final segment. Sure. Tell us how your research has changed or become more rigorous, I suppose, in the last few years. And what is it that you offer clients? Is that something that obviously is very important, people going to regions where ISIS is located? And as journalists, how do you protect yourself, but also get the story that the public wants and needs to know?
ISIS is a whole different animal than things that we've dealt with in the past. It's they specifically target journalists, as we've seen from the targeted kidnappings and murders of people like James Foley, which is just terrible. I've clients who are quite good friends with James, and it's a terrible loss, and it's the shock of that is still reverberating through the community, and it's actually spurred people on to recognize that the journalism is still very dangerous, and it's been thrown in the public's face now of journalists need to be protected, But in terms of ISIS working in the regions that ISIS inhabits, so southern Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, after all those incidents that happened, at the start of the year and last year, a lot of journalists are now just reporting from Erbil in northern Iraq regarding everything from southern Turkey to Syria. It's a good base of operations to operate from because you can deploy to the front lines within 4 hours from Erbil. It's a good place to set up, and it's when I've been to northern Iraq 3 times in the last 12 months with clients, and each time taking them out to the front line, but you get to come back at night. You get to come back to the hotel, they do their story and broadcast it, or whether they're broadcasting it live or they're going to broadcast it later. And it's very controlled when we go out to these frontline areas with the Peshmerga. I give briefings, as do the rest of my staff, and each morning before we leave the hotel, and all the while keep them updated with intelligence briefings. And a lot of the intelligence that our news clients gain comes from us, and it comes from our contacts on the ground, because me personally, Iraq is my bread and butter. That's the place that I'm most familiar with, and I have the most contacts on the ground and have quite high up connections with the Peshmerga and Iraqi military, and we achieve quite good results with our clients whilst in Iraq. But we're very, very strict on clients' movements while we're on the front line there in northern Iraq, and it's very controlled. We need to know where they are at all times. They don't go anywhere without us. And it needs to be that way, because it only takes a split second of not knowing where your client is, or the correspondent wandering off. They get they get their blinders on when looking through that lens, and it's very, very dangerous. It should never be underestimated, and you're never going to see the bullet coming. It's a very dangerous situation. I don't think any journalist should attempt to be going into Syria at the moment at all. It's just too dangerous, especially in northern Syria, or crossing in from southern Turkey. And it's very easy to cross southern Turkey, as is all the international, a lot of international people have joined ISIS. They've gone through southern Turkey's very porous borders, and they've made a token attempt to close those borders, but it hasn't done anything to stop the flow of international jihadis going to join Daesh. And journalists can cross over the same way. That's how Stephen Sotloff was captured. He crossed, and then not far across the border, he was picked up. And a lot of people blame his fixer for that. Fixer selection is very, very important. You have to trust your fixer. I tell clients who aren't deploying somewhere with us, if they're going alone, that the fixer has to be someone that they either know have worked with before, or recommended by a very trusted friend who's used them before. get their CV, find out where they've worked before. Fixer selection is hugely important. Yeah.
Just briefly, what for people who don't know, well, what is the definition of a fixer, and where would one find a fixer? How is that different from what you do?
Well, a fixer is someone who lives in the area, usually someone who speaks the language fluently. There's no way I'm going to be able to, or my staff are going to be able to speak the language in every country that we go to. It's just not possible. And when you have a fixer, they can also act as a translator, but they can also get certain things on the ground that you need at a cheaper price. Because if I go and source everything from fuel to accommodation to food and water, I'll get charged a foreigner's price, which is hugely expensive. But if we send the fixer out to get these certain things, he has local contacts and local, he knows the back alleys and things like that. It's a lot safer to have a fixer there that you trust, who can get you discounts on everything regarding your logistics, and it can also lead you in, even just in terms of choosing routes and to get to your destination. Google Maps isn't going to work in Iraq because it's going to take you somewhere quite dangerous. It doesn't take into account terrorism, not since I last checked. So having a
who
fixer,
knows? We could go in that direction at some point.
They'll probably prove me wrong now. They'll come out with a map that shows you where all ISIS locations are. That'd be quite handy. But no, fixers are very important. They basically they're the guy on the ground that gets you what you need, and they get it at a discounted price because they're locals. And it's great having a guy on the ground that can do that for you. They're really important.
Yeah, they probably don't get the attention that they deserve.
No.
Just wrapping up here, Shannon, based on your military experience, your experience with the company, I'm interested to know, sort of back here in the States, you're in a safe place now. How is it that you go day to day in terms of the way that you view the world, walking into a mall, the grocery store, the post office? How has it changed your view and your eyes and the ways that you interact with people when you're not in a war zone?
Well,
really, how do you carry on day to day? Because that's also a question for journalists and certainly anyone who's worked in the military and been in disaster zones. Yeah. But you in particular, tell us how that's affected your day to day.
Well, it's changed my perspective of things completely. I can't walk into a restaurant or a mall or any other public place without, and I do it subconsciously now because I've done it for so long. I count how many people I can see. I look where the exits are, where alternate exits are. I even study the people that are around me. I feel you're always switched on. You're always situationally aware, and I always press that with clients and with even friends. And my fiance, it drives her insane because I go into a restaurant, I have to sit facing the door with my back to a wall, and it's just habits that I have that have garnered over my career, and especially working in the private sector where you have no backup. It's just you there, and you've got a lot of people's lives that come under your responsibility. You're constantly switched on, constantly aware, positioning yourself so you're not off balance, even just standing somewhere, watching somebody who's acting strangely, whether they're walking strangely, it looks like they've got something under their jacket. It's just always studying your environment, always being aware. You never want to get caught out, somewhere, literally almost with your pants down. Like you have to be ready for any situation, and subconsciously I do that. And I'm very involved with the veteran community here in the States and also back home in Australia, and we're all the same. We're all like that. There's a situational awareness that you get, and I think a lot of conflict reporters, experienced conflict reporters, have that same situational awareness. They're always on the lookout, always watching. And it's a very important part of my job, but it's something I pride myself on as well, is noticing things, and it keeps you sharp as well. Even walking down the street, putting yourself between you and your partner, between the cars and herself, and things like that. It keeps you sharp, keeps you on edge, because I can't let go of that edge in my line of work. It's I need that for when we deploy.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing that. On a personal level, it makes for interesting times when you're not actually deployed.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to now move into a little bit more of a fun segment that I like to call the Jennifer's 5 W's and H. And this, of course, is structured after the who, what, where, why, when, how of good news writing. And
Yep.
since you've worn a journalist hat, you're probably familiar with that.
Yep.
I'll just ask you a few questions that require either good memory or just a one-word response, or
Sure.
just whatever comes to mind. So we'll start off. Who is your best friend?
My best friend is a guy who I served in the military with. He currently lives in Australia, but he's been my best friend for a number of years. Yeah, I can't say his name because he's still involved in the special operations community in Australia, but he's a very good person.
And he knows you well, I'm sure.
Yes.
Tell us, we touched on this a little bit. What is your language training? Are you proficient in other languages besides English?
I do speak some Spanish, and my Arabic, whilst in Arabic countries, is decent. But I understand more than I can speak, and my Australian accent gets quite a laugh out of the native Arabic speakers. They get quite a laugh out of hearing me speak. So I'm not sure if they understand me, but they often laugh at me because of the Australian accent. Yeah.
All right. Well, anything to lighten the mood.
Yeah.
If they want to take a stab at your accent. When did you first realize you wanted to do this line of work?
That's a good question. It was before I even joined the military. It might be a little bit of a lame story, but I watched a movie called Proof of Life with Russell Crowe and Meg Ryan, and I watched that movie and I thought, you know what, I could do that. That's something that I think I'd be quite good at, and here I am doing almost exactly that. Not as Hollywood, of course, but it's something that that I pride myself on, that, achieving dreams and doing what I set out to do. So yeah, it was based off a movie when I was a young fella.
All right, well, I'll have to pick that up at the rental store or Netflix. Yeah. Where were you on January 7th, 2015? And just to jog your memory, that was the day of the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris earlier this year. Do you remember getting the news on that day?
I was in Iraq at that time. I was in northern Iraq, and I remember seeing it on BBC News when we were in the hotel in Erbil, and I saw it, and I didn't know if it was something that had happened a while back, or I'd just woken up and I saw it, and then everyone was gathered around the TV. More and more people were coming in watching this, and we were just shocked. Unbelievable that this was happening, right in the middle of somewhere that they didn't expect it to happen, right in the middle of Paris. It wasn't expected at all, and it just sent, shockwaves throughout everyone that was there, because the whole hotel was full of media, and I believe some of the people who were staying at the hotel knew people from Charlie Hebdo. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy.
Okay. I notice you're attending university now. Why are you doing that, and what are you studying?
I'm studying at Edith Cowan University via distance learning. It's a bachelor's degree in counterterrorism, security, and intelligence. It's quite a extensive and lengthy course, and degree, but it's worth it in the end to have that tertiary education in your portfolio. It's not particularly needed in regards to my operational work, but I'm doing more and more TV and radio news interviews, and I find it helps to be able to discuss it from a academic's point of view, and not just someone who's been there, done that. I think it adds more weight and more, it makes what I'm saying more reliable in the eyes of some people. So I think it's a benefit. You should never stop training, never stop learning. Once you think you've learned everything, you shouldn't be doing that job anymore. You're a danger to yourself and the people that work with you. So always learning, always adapting, and I'm enjoying it. It's hard work, but it's good.
Okay, it sounds like you're coupling your practical experience with academic. So
Yeah.
yeah, it makes you a good speaker on the topic. Lastly, how do you suggest student journalists or new journalists to the profession get involved with international reporting, those who would like to go to either war or conflict or disaster zones?
Well, it's good to find a good mentor. I found in speaking with more senior clients of ours, they said they had a mentor and they found someone who did that line of work, and they spoke to them and they spoke about what was involved. And you have to be aware of the entire reality of the situation. It's a very rough job. It's oftentimes thankless. Most people aren't going to get famous doing it. You're going to be a little bit more behind the scenes until you reach, someone's level of, say, Anna Corrin from CNN, who I've met a couple of times. She's lovely, a very, very talented reporter. And it's, I think there needs to be more training in, journalism schools like Columbia and who have quite distinguished journalism universities and modules that they teach. There needs to be a bit more of conflict journalism involved, and also almost a embedded heat course within their structure of their education, and that way it ticks that box off before they even get a chance to go out in the field. I think that's really important, and a lot of people ignore, and it's a point that I was meaning to bring up earlier, ignore that it's not just conflict journalists that require safety training and risk awareness training. It's national journalists as well, local journalists who are just field journalists. They might not go to conflict zones, but they're just reporting on everyday events around their city. It's still very important for them to know first aid. You look at situations like the tragedy that happened in Virginia recently with the two reporters that were murdered by a fellow, previous employee of their news station. Also in San Francisco at the pier when the cameraman was assaulted and his equipment was stolen off him. There needs to be a basic risk awareness and risk analysis and first aid and personal safety training done at even just a basic field journalist level. We run those courses as well. A basic field journalist's safety awareness course. It's not as involved as the heat course, but it's very, very practical and very useful to just your basic field journalist.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, we didn't even touch on active shooter training. I mean, we have focused on the journalists, but you're right. Even here in the United States, or nationally in your own country, you don't have to go to what's considered a war zone. And of course, the tragedy that you brought up that occurred in Virginia just a month or so ago with the cameraman and the reporter, there could be things that news stations could be aware of. I was just at the SPJ annual convention, and they had held a full topic on that on one of the breakout sessions. And, the discussion was about the fact that news station didn't even hold another live shot for a good 3 weeks, that either reporters didn't want to, and producers, or they didn't want to ask their staff. And people were understandably afraid, which is unfortunate because it really does censor the news, whether or not it's unfounded or not.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. And, as I go back to that topic that I always go back to is duty of care. Media organizations have a duty of care to their staff and those that they hire, even that they're freelancers, that they're prepared for any situation. I don't know many field journalists who have had risk awareness or risk analysis training along with trauma, first aid, and personal safety awareness, even basic self-defense courses, when it comes down to that last resort. It's something that would be very useful to a field journalist, especially working in large cities like, Chicago or, Detroit, somewhere that has quite a high level of gun violence. They call Chicago Chirac for a reason.
Oh, yeah, I had not heard that.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add, Shannon, just as we wrap up here, that maybe we didn't touch on?
Oh, no, that's like I stated earlier, we work mostly with journalists and media corporations, but we also do work with schools. We've just launched our active shooter training for schools in the US and also in Australia. It's not so much needed in Australia, but the option is there. But we've been quite busy with that in stateside here, and it's been received quite with open arms, especially with the latest incidents occurring here in the States. And, forearmed is forewarned. And, all of our training aligns with Department of Homeland Security guidelines, and, it's nationally recognised qualification. Also, first aid is a nationally recognised qualification we provide to the teaching staff as well. So that's something we've been quite busy with aside from our journalist work. But our bread and butter is definitely journalism work, and I really enjoy it. We've got a couple of deployments coming up towards the end of the year, and looking forward to those.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, I'm focusing on journalists, but I suppose a topic for another future show would be active shooter training. And it's unfortunate that that is a business, but luckily there are outfits and companies like yours that do offer the training. I have many friends who work in the education industry, and unfortunately it's something that they need to be aware of. So really on all those fronts, thank you, Shannon, very much for being a guest here today. Really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Good. Yeah, I'd love to follow up and find out where your deployments are and just changes in the industry as we go. Sure. This is Jennifer Karchmer in the Transparency Report. You can find more on my website at jenniferkarchmer.com and elsewhere on social media, of course on Twitter at journalist_JK, and on Facebook, and of course just Google. Thanks again, everyone. I appreciate it, and have a nice day.